Hello, I'm Robert Martinez. I'm the state historian of New Mexico, and this is New Mexico History in 10 Minutes. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition unless you lived in the Spanish Empire between the years 1571 and 1821. I need to talk about that institution because it's very famous, it's infamous, and sometimes misunderstood. It was very much part of Spanish life, starting in 1479. Queen Isabel and King Fernando in Spain established the Inquisition to police conversos, converts to Catholicism from Islam and Judaism, and also to police old Christians, the priests, and to make sure that their realms were being protected from outside influences deemed unhealthy. But before we do that, before we get to the Inquisition in Spain and then in Mexico and ultimately in New Mexico, I want to give a little bit of background. The origins of the Inquisition go back to the Roman Empire. They had an Inquisitio as part of their civil managing of their society. The Inquisitio was essentially like the police or detectives. If there was a problem between citizens, the Inquisitio was an inquiry that would take place to investigate and find out what the problem was and ultimately get rid of the problem before it spread throughout the society. So when the Christian church took over the Roman Empire in the 300s, the Catholics, especially in the West, took on a lot of the institutions and governing methods that the Romans had. So this is where the Inquisition comes into place, especially in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, when the Bishops' Inquisition was established to combat the heresy of the Cathars, the Catharists in southern France. This was a heresy that preached dualism, the idea that all physical matter is evil and all spiritual things are good. So the idea is that there are two gods, essentially, a good God and an evil God fighting each other for supremacy. Well, this led to these Cathars preaching against things like physical relations or marriage, which promotes physical relations. And so the attack on the sacrament of marriage and other Christian ideas meant that the Catholics in the area needed to do something about this. So the local bishop was given inquisitorial authority and he condemned Cathars. They were like the old Manichaeans of ancient history. And what happened next was the punishment was handed over to the civil authorities, and soldiers then went to those communities, such as at Carcassonne in France, and they executed and eliminated the Cathars. So that's the first Inquisition of the Catholic Church in the 1200s. By the end of the 1300s, that Inquisition falls into disuse. There were no real problems to deal with. But once we get to the 1500s, we have the challenge of Martin Luther, a priest who's starting to challenge the authority of the church, so for good reason, but it leads to the establishment of the Inquisition in Rome, the Roman Inquisition, which dealt with heresies such as Protestantism from the perspective of the Catholic Church, and with challenges such as Galileo's heliocentric concept, an old idea, but he fell into the grips of the Inquisition of Rome. But that's different from the Spanish Inquisition. That one was established by the crown. Those other Inquisitions had to answer to the Pope in Rome, but the Spanish version answered to the King and Queen of Spain. So it was a little different. It was religious, but it was also political in nature. And we'll see how it's used throughout the empire for both abuses or perceived abuses. So this Inquisition of Spain, the Spanish Inquisition, was used essentially against conversos. This meant if you were Jewish or Muslim and converted to Catholicism, you were under the authority of the Inquisition. Now, a Jew or a Muslim was not under the authority of the Inquisition, and they were not ever put on trial or punished by the Inquisition. But if you were a converso, a convert, yes, you could be in trouble if you converted outwardly to Catholicism, but went home and practiced that old-time religion, your old Jewish rituals or Muslim rituals, then you could get into some real trouble. Well, this Inquisition is imported to Nueva España, New Spain, around 1570 to replace the Bishop's Inquisition that was in place in Mexico City starting around 1530 or so under Bishop Juan de Zumárraga. He got into trouble because an Indian was punished under his authority for dogmatizing or preaching against Catholicism. The Indian died, and so that's about the time when the Church and Crown decided that Indians could not be under the authority of the Inquisition because they were essentially considered innocent and needed to be catechized, converted, and evangelized. So this version that shows up in 1570 is what you see in Spain, and it goes after heretics, people practicing Judaism in secrecy or believed to have entered into a pact with the devil or practicing witchcraft. Witchcraft was usually seen as superstition and delusion by the Inquisition, but usually it would come under the heavy authority of inquisitors if heresy was involved. In other words, the idea that church teaching and essential teachings of the church are being disregarded or denied, and it's being preached to the community. So this is what we see happening in Mexico City. And I found in Mexico City's National Archives a few years back a catalog of San Benitos. San Benitos were the vests that heretics had to wear in public, declaring their crime and their penance. These were usually hung in the church for a good amount of time. If you can imagine that, you were shamed in public. So this is an interesting document that it spans, I think, something like 1528 to 1675, something like that. And it lists about 395 people, and 90% of the accused were judaizantes, people accused of being secret Jews. Other accusations were, again, pact with the devil, witchcraft, being Lutheran. It's fascinating because we sometimes think of Mexico in the 1700s, 1600s, 1500s as Native American and Spanish with some Africans thrown in. It is that, but it's a lot more. Mexico City in 1620 was probably a lot like New York City. You'd see Native American people, Spanish people, African, Portuguese, people from Morocco, Italy, from Ireland, England. Those were the folks that would get into trouble from the Protestant countries. They could be corralled up and taken before the Inquisition as Luteranos. But that was a catch-all term for a Protestant. In those days, it was believed if you were a Protestant, you were originally a Catholic who turned your back on the church. So you see this institution in Mexico City starting around 1570. And if you've ever been to Mexico City and seen the Zócalo, the big plaza there, and if you look at the cathedral, you're facing the cathedral, there's a street to the left that goes all the way back. If you walk that way about 2 blocks, you'll come to the Plaza de Santo Domingo. And there's a church there. And right across the street is the building that housed the Inquisition and the secret jails that were there, the jail cells. So it's quite fascinating. When I was there, it was a museum, if you can imagine that. I went into the exhibit of Leonardo da Vinci's inventions they had there, but I went in to see that and to see where the Inquisition was housed, because this is a fascinating history. The trial for accused heretic before the Inquisition was a lot more legalistic and detailed than many people believe it. It seems like it's a kangaroo court where everyone was found guilty and burned at the stake, but that's not what happened. Typically, it was very detailed. Both sides were presented, and It looked a lot like what you have happening here. The lawyers for each side were exaggerating accusations, exaggerating defenses, but it gives us an insight into the life and times of people. And consider this, a lot of times people wanted to go on trial before the Inquisition as opposed to the civil authorities who they felt were not very fair and were too rigid and strict. Well, this Inquisition ultimately will find its way to outlying areas of the Spanish Empire, places like New Mexico. We'll see that in 1625, when Fray Alonso de Benavides comes as the custos of the Franciscans, he is the agent of the Inquisition, and he has the authority to conduct investigations and determine whether a case is serious enough to be sent to Mexico City, to the Santo Oficio, the Holy Office of the Inquisition. Check out what happens next time. Hasta luego. Bye.